I thought I'd basically take this opportunity to reflect a bit on how my research has progressed since I began my PhD 2 years ago, and also presented at the first Wharf Institute Research Day, that very exciting day in 2018, when I spoke about my plans for the PhD. And basically back then I planned to study Sunni Shia sectarian in the monarchical period as a means to understand the kind of turbulent history of the country in more recent decades. And specifically, I was interested in this notion of sectarianization of the Iraqi Shia community. So that's meaning like the process whereby kind of benign religious identity among the Shia was transformed into a political identity that was hostile or belligerent to other faiths and kind of assertively political. And it was my hypothesis that the sort of institutional framework of the British-backed colonial state in Iraq at that time had engendered this process of sectarianization. And I think as my research progressed, and perhaps as my affiliation with the Wharf Institute became more firm, and I immersed myself in my primary sources, which is journals and newspapers published in Najaf, which is the city you can see in this slide, during the interwar period, I realized that this approach was essentially flawed and wrong, because it reduced the sort of complex dynamics of interwar religious and secular politics in Iraq to a simple trajectory of radicalization, which was more reflective of political currents today than of those which had currency during the early years of the Iraqi state. And more than this, I thought it reduced the history of interfaith relations to a linear, unidirectional binary of sectarianization followed by desectarianization. And this is a kind of enticing but deceiving model of relations between religious groups, which seems to kind of be predicated on the notion that things need to get bad in general terms before they get better. It's certainly true that the period that I'm studying was not one of universal communal harmony, and that goes for relations between sects and pretty much any other social group, whether it be ethnic, socioeconomic, or indeed rural and urban divisions in Iraq at this time. The 1920s and 1930s in Iraq are littered with incidents of violence and communal tension or tribal disturbances, some of which were explicitly sectarian in their nature, and others of which were sort of possessed sectarian undertones. So they were kind of expressions of sectarian sentiment bubbling underneath the surface of Iraqi politics. And the period also witnessed the emergence of political movements and political parties, which were based on communalistic and religious principles. All of this, as has been well documented by other historians and social scientists, was part of the story of modernity and nation building, and the transformation of pluralistic and sort of horizontally segregated pre-modern imperial states into modern states, which preserved, in theory, at least the illusion of equality between all citizens. So the consolidation of integrated nation states, whether or not it occurred in a colonial setting, was invariably a contentious and violent process, where physical and symbolic boundaries between peoples and space were drawn and fought over. From Switzerland to the Balkans, India, and the Middle East, religion has often been the critical marker of identity for determining who is in and who is out, and a contested field for the imagination of the nation. And I think the Jewish experience in Iraq is obviously perhaps the most poignant example of this in the case of my research. But crucially, and this is what I've really come to see over the last couple of years, this kind of bleak hit story is only half of the true history of this period. As Osama Makdisi has recently poignantly remarked in a recent book, every history of sectarianism is also a history of coexistence. And it was this notion of devising ways and means for multiple faiths to live together in the modern state, of promoting an ecumenical frame for the future, which really stuck with me as I was trawling through my primary sources, which is these kind of relics of the Najafi public sphere. Shia intellectuals, clerics, poets, and journalists producing this material may at times have stoked the flames of communal or intercommunal strife. But on the whole, their vision was democratic and inclusive, ecumenical and conciliatory. Calls for unity were often louder, well, pretty much always louder than those for division, and as were calls for social justice and education. And it's this notion of education which I think is really important and really sticks. Education seemed to have a very broad meaning, but primarily it meant educating those outside of the Shia faith, much in the way that the Wolf Institute attempts to do for all faiths, about what it meant to be Shia, and how and also to show these people outside of the faith that Shiism was compatible in a social and theological terms with mainstream Sunni Islam. And this meant that my period witnessed a cascade of publications on Shia practice, theology, and history, all produced with the intention of reaching non-Shia audience. It also meant that Najaf hosted delegations from outside of Iraq, from Egypt, or people who had negative views about Shiism, where their views were challenged. And it meant the reform of aspects of the faith as well, to make them more comprehensible and rational to an external audience. In short, it meant engaging and sustaining a dialogue with Sunni Muslim clerics and intellectuals, and indeed, I guess, society more generally, as a means to expel misconceptions and fallacies about these two admittedly quite similar Islamic legal and theological traditions. And I think what is particularly noteworthy about these interfaith efforts, and something that I really want to draw out, is that they occurred simultaneously alongside episodes of interfaith discord. So the two, efforts to improve interfaith relations on the one hand, and those to destabilize them on the other, developed concomitantly throughout the history of the Iraqi state. And while the delicate balance between the two has often been tilted or heavily tilted in favor of one over the other, neither has ever yet proved hegemonic. And I think the last year before the COVID pandemic was a good reminder of this, when we saw protests sweeping Iraq, calling for political and social reform, all of which adopted a distinctly anti-sectarian agenda. And this is really a reminder, ultimately, that interfaith initiatives, as much as sectarian ones, are an indelible part of the story of nation building and modernity in the Middle East, and pretty much in the whole world.